Hi, everyone. Welcome to our glorious second week of the legislature, Tuesday, January 9th. As will be our tradition, we're going to spend Tuesday afternoons talking about education finance for the foreseeable future. We might add extra days as we need to, but this is going to be our usual go-to. We are happy to be joined by House Education today. Welcome, everyone over there, who I think will also be joining us sometimes as their schedule can make it work. So last week we talked about the December 1st letter. We looked at the education fund outlook. We understand that school needs are high, spending is high, and tax rates are projected to be higher than last year in a fairly significant way. I'm hoping that today we will be able to spend some time really just getting our heads around the complexity of the situation, that there's no one cause for any of this. And it's parallel. There is no one solution to any of this. But right now, we're really just going to be trying to level set on the situation at hand and try to focus on solutions maybe next week, maybe the week after. I don't know. But this is a serious issue. Affects all Vermonters, kids, teachers, schools, and then all of us taxpayers. So today we're gonna really just sort of dive into the situation, as I said. So we're gonna start off with Julia Richter, oh, there you are. Hi. I'm just gonna give us a quick overview of the outlook again, which has actually experienced a couple changes since last we touched it last Tuesday. Welcome.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Madam Chair, would you like me to share my screen?
Yes, please.
So if folks are looking to pull this up on their own devices, it is shared on the committee page under my name. Also got it here. So we're all looking at the same thing. Before diving into what we're seeing here, just a couple of broad strokes. I was asked to update the Ed Fund outlook with a few pieces to present here today. So really the primary changes that we're looking at here as compared to the Ed Fund outlook that we looked at last week, which was a reflection of the December 1 modeling, is really twofold. One is it has been updated in FY24 to reflect the governor's recommended budget adjustment act. I guess there's three pieces. So it's including the governor's recommended budget adjustment act. It's including H541, which we also spoke about last week. That's the flood property tax abatement bill. And to correct myself on the record, after further discussion with my colleagues at Ledge Council and the tax department, I agree that it's an FY24 cost. So that's why it's been booked here. And FY24 is 1.1 million. And then I've also included current use tax expenditure. This is one of the many tax expenditures in the education fund. And it's already included in the non-homestead education property tax, but just to have a sense of scale as one of the tax expenditures, it's been included here.
And in future weeks, we will be able to spend more time talking about tax expenditures related to the education fund. Though we won't be able to get a full read on it, probably ever.
Yes. There are a lot of tax expenditures and they are in different tax types as well. So with those updates to the Ed Fund and the corresponding modeling, we've resolved for the property yield, the income yield, and the non-homestead property tax rate. This has been solved again as a uniform average change across all three classes. So we're seeing those updates here in lines D, E, for the yields, and line C for the non-homestead tax rate. We'll recall that these are all equalized. So before the application of the CLA, as is everything in the Ed Fund outlook. And we see that those updates correspond with an average bill change of 19.3, which is a little bit up from the December 1 modeling. And that's really a reflection of the updated changes with the corresponding BAA adjustments, as well as the inclusion of the H541.
Seeing no questions? Thank you. Sure. So next, we're going to invite Jeff Francis up. All of our witnesses today, with the exception of Julia, have brought a lot of friends with them. I mean, you have friends in the world. You used to be the committee room. I said friends with them. Many friends, even in this room. And so what we're going to try to do is, Jeff, essentially, really happy to hear from you what you want to say for overarching remarks, and then the other folks in the room, I would sort of call on you if there was a question, and you would defer to someone else.
Great. I'm going to grab my water, which I left over there.
It's also remarkably hot in this room.
Yeah. Really?
We could crack a window.
We can try.
Chris, he's the one who bought it last year.
Where's Chris? Yeah. Thank you, Julia. I think you're gonna have to open the storm too. We're just gonna give you a moment to get ready, Jeff.
Totally. I'm happy to do that.
46 from two times this many people. Still in that room.
Hello, good afternoon. I am Jeff Francis, the Executive Director for the Vermont Superintendent's Association. I'm happy to be here with you today. It's great to see people not only in the committee, but also on the sidelines. I have provided Sorsha and Annie with copies of my written testimony. And sometimes I refer to my testimony more often than in other instances. I'm going to go through it today the way I've written it, because when I wrote it, it was collaborative, so people contributed to this. And also I want to make sure not to miss any points. I took note of the fact that Tuesday afternoon in Ways and Means is Ed Finance Day. So now I know where I'll be Tuesdays into the future. And to me, that's helpful to know that you're going to focus on Ed Finance, at least on Tuesday afternoons, because there's more to talk about than I'm going to talk about today. So in responding to the chair's invitation, I intend to give some high-level remarks, and I'm also going to focus on what I was asked specifically to focus on today, which is cost pressures on local school district budgets. So as I noted, I'm Jeff Francis. I have several colleagues with me today. To my left are Sue Siglowski, who's the Executive Director of the School Boards Association. To her right is Morgan Daybell here, who is the President of the Vermont Association of School Business Officials. The reason that Sue and Morgan are with me is through the fall, the Superintendent's Association, which I represent, did a lot of work with the school business officials and the School Boards Association in terms of working with the field around the changes in the education funding system and what we were looking at in terms of this budgeting cycle. I also have with me one in person, one virtually, Libby Bonesteel, who's the president, excuse me, not the president, she's the superintendent for the Montpelier Roxbury School District, and Mark Tucker, who's off the screen over my left shoulder, who is the superintendent for the Caledonia Central Supervisory Union. They're both members of VSA's 10-member board of trustees. So despite the fact that I have license to move in this building and talk about education and education policy issues, I report to a 10-member board of trustees. And we've had conversations in each of the last 3 or 4 days around this testimony specifically and what's happening in education funding in general. So I invited Libby and Mark to be here today, because if you have specific questions about the manifestation of the FY 2025 budgeting cycle and how it affects school districts specifically, they're going to be able to respond to those questions better than I would. Just also by way of contextual comments, the Board of Trustees for VSA's 10 members, we meet monthly, but in instances like this fall, we meet more frequently when there's cause to. So I wanted to open that way. in light of the current focus, which I would say is unusual in terms of the emphasis on FY25 budgets, I've been conferring with those folks, as I indicated. And I think it's fair to say that in my experience as executive director for the Superintendent's Association, I've not seen a more dynamic budget cycle. And you'll get into that in subsequent Tuesdays. I'll talk a little bit about it today, and you may as well. I'm going to focus on the well-known and well understood by many of you considerations in the school budgeting process, but I may introduce some thoughts at least that you hadn't considered. My main area of emphasis today is cost pressures affecting the current budgeting cycle. And as I noted in my introductory comments, when you get in more substantively into other areas of education funding in future Tuesdays, I'd be happy to come back and participate. In fact, I'd be eager to come back and participate in those conversations as well. Before I get into cost pressures in the FY25 budgeting cycle specifically, I want to provide two pieces of context. And this is one that I think maybe folks don't think about as much. The first is that while we have a well-established statewide education funding system, education is delivered through local school systems. So there's really two components. It's what happens at the state level in terms of decisions that you make and how those decisions play out at the local school district level. And in order to illustrate, I think, sort of the exponential nature of the various combinations of thought processes that take place locally, I wanted to point out that in Vermont, we have 120 school districts, and I see in my testimony here it says 121, but there are 120 school districts that are governed by nearly 900 locally elected school board members. And by way of comparison, Representative Beck just mentioned to me Act 46. Prior to Act 46, there were 277 school districts governed by more than 1,500 school board members. So we've got 120 districts, 900 locally elected school board members. Those districts employ 56 superintendents who oversee an equal number of central offices, including school business managers, and supervise more than 300 principals providing educational and operational leadership in Vermont schools statewide. The reason that I say that is because there's often dialogue around what's happening generally in the field relative to the application of the education funding system. And I would say it's not unlike politics locally. It plays out in a vast array of different ways, depending on what the configuration, the experience, the needs are in those local communities. So I think, you could assign the no set rule applies in terms of not only what happens locally, but why it happens. In other years, when I've come in here post-town meeting to talk about what the experience has been with local school district budgets, I'll report on defeats and of school budgets in various communities. And I'm not going to do it today, but normally I can talk about 6 or 7 or 8 districts that always have a hard time getting their budgets passed. And that's really an indication of what the dynamics are in those communities. So I'm saying this because in today's conversation and in future conversations, it's important to compare a statewide education funding system with how that funding system plays out in local communities. I'm going to add parenthetically here because I'll come back to it. Act 127 application and the CLA, two big talking points that are happening currently in conversations, not only in this building, but across the state, are playing out locally in different ways. So I wanted to say that. The second thing that I wanted to note is that we're talking about more than $2 billion in taxpayers spent annually. And we're talking about an education system that has the dynamics reflected in the characteristics that I just referred to, every year, our public education delivery system in Vermont is asked to respond to an array of laws, regulations, and requirements that are often compounded by societal factors. It's a very complicated system. It's asked to perform every year in terms of not only its traditional charge, but its expanded charge. And when you think about support for the system, in addition to everything that happens locally, we rely on the Agency of Education to support information, understanding, and application of whatever changes take place. Sometimes those changes are associated with changes in the ed funding system, like we're experiencing this year. And other times they're called upon to respond to things like Act 173, which changed the way we provide supports to the neediest students. So it's a complicated system. No surprise then that the manifestation of cost pressures, particularly in a year like FY25, are pretty vivid in terms of the way they affect what's happening locally. So, let's see, I've sort of altered my script, so I'm going to get back onto it. As I just indicated, we rely heavily on the AOE. So Brad and Nicole, who are here with you today, are essentially the skunk works at the AOE to make sure districts have what they need in terms of information. And the information that they collect in the lead up to the December 1 tax letter relies on the data that they collect. That information, as conveyed by the December 1 tax letter to legislators, the administration, and the field, this year indicated, and this was a high-profile piece of news, that school district budgets were projected to be up 12%, and that we were going to see a resultant 18% tax increase. Understandably, that's captured everyone's attention, right? So that happened 1st of December. It was news for a week. People were digesting that news, and now that the General Assembly has reassembled, we're back at that. I'll note parenthetically here, because I don't think it's in this written testimony, that when you think about what's the best word to use here? How things line up. One of the things that we're noticing this year is that school district budget making processes for FY25 are nearly complete. They'll warn their budgets at the end of January, and yet you are all just starting your legislative session. So when you think about the conversations you're going to have in future Tuesdays, you may have realizations that are important to the FY25 budgeting cycle, but there's going to be little that you're going to be able to do that will affect that cycle. So one of the things that is obvious to us this year is as these 12% budget increases manifest themselves in projected high property tax rates, if you were inclined to do anything about it, you're pretty limited in terms of what you could do about it. So I wanted to make that point. In terms of the broad public messaging around 12% projected education spending increases and a resultant 18% property tax increase, that's a pretty simple declaration. It's like, okay, school district budgets are going up 12%, taxes are going to go up 18% as a result of it. That's a pretty simple statement to make, but the backstory is not as simple. Morgan Daybell, who's here with me today and is the president of the Vermont Association of School Business Officials, did a survey to inform this testimony of school districts, his colleagues among the ranks of school business officials. And he, in the early response to his survey, has determined that with 1/3 of districts responding, that there's a wide range in per pupil education spending changes of -35% to +45%. And that pre-CLA tax rate changes associated with those changes in ed spending range from minus 21% to plus 32%. Again, shows the variability in the response in the budgeting process statewide. Through my work with superintendents and with my colleagues from VSBA and VASBO, who are in close contact with the members of their respective associations, we can attempt to foster a more nuanced understanding of the significant cost pressures and cost centers that are contributing to the substantial increase in proposed school district budgets this year. While on point, these explanations should not be considered detailed in that we can't tell you the individual story for every school district. But we can discuss trends and we can support the explanations with examples from Morgan and the superintendents who are here with me today. So yesterday we met to revisit the cost factors that we wanted to most specifically call to your attention, and they are as follows. And I think this is the crux of what you wanted to hear from me today. So there's tremendous upward pressure on salaries and wages that have resulted in higher collective bargaining amount settlements in general than we were seeing in the pre-pandemic years. Factors contributing to those settlements are, based on our experience and what we're observing, one, overall worker shortages and the need to be competitive within the education delivery system, recognition of the challenging conditions that school system personnel contended with during and as we emerged from the pandemic, inflation, empathy for school personnel on the part of school boards and school administrators, competition for employees, school system to school system, and with outside employers. And as contracts were settled to district, the tendency by the Vermont NEA and sometimes by school boards to use other recent settlements as comparisons and finalizing agreements. So in summary, with respect to collective bargaining, there's been tremendous upward pressure on settlements. And I would say that in my experience, when I look at the results, and this is anecdotal, of settled school district contracts this year and less, in general, they have higher percentage increases than I had ever seen before. So people are being paid more in FY25 for an array of factors. Now, when you consider that salaries equate to roughly 75% of school district budgets, if you increase those salaries by a particular percentage, then it's got a material effect on what your overall budget increase is. The second factor that we wanted to put before you today was steep increases, and for FY25 it's 16.4% in the cost of health insurance, which since 2019 has been collectively bargained at the state level by representatives of the Vermont School Boards Association and Vermont NEA. Recent testimony, meaning last week in the House Education Committee, by VSBA and the commissioners representing employers on the Public School Employee Health Benefits Commission, cites the lack of policy levers sufficient to contain costs in the negotiations incorporated as part of the bargaining process. So one of the things that we're seeing is in healthcare bargaining, an expected or hoped for outcome, at least on the part of the employer side, that we were going to be able to use those negotiations to realize some cost containment, and I realize that may only be the management perspective, but to realize some cost containment haven't materialized because the policy levers to gain that cost containment don't exist within the current law. The third effect, which is harder to quantify in real dollars in simple testimony, but can be informed by more testimony from local school officials, goes to the costs that are being borne by school districts relative to burgeoning mental health needs in our communities, as those needs play out in communities at a time when the ability for mental health resources that are outside school systems are diminishing. The erosion of community mental health resources results in the need to enhance resources within schools. This factor has led to obvious and measurable expansion in positions in schools that are necessary to respond to these societal factors and their associated measurable costs. Stated another way, when I talk to superintendents and business managers about what's driving their budgets, the need to address the mental health needs of students within school systems using school resources rather than outside community resources almost always comes up. And that has effects that extend beyond this point. It really goes to the cost of personnel, the availability of personnel, the complexity of the delivery system. So in my view, that's something that is definitely worth having the General Assembly take a look at in terms of the system of the education delivery system. And I can remember in 2006, I believe it was, the legislature commissioned a report which was known as the so-called Pink Report, that looked at the cost of human services that were being delivered in public schools. And it was an issue then, and I would say as an issue that needs to be tended to, it's expanded dramatically since 2006 and expanded even more dramatically as a result of the effects of the pandemic.
And I'm trying not to editorialize
Sure.
testimony, but I'll just add at that I know that House Ed is taking testimony about community schools at some point this week, when I imagine some of that would come up naturally, but maybe there could be a deeper dive related to this. And then House Healthcare is planning to take up the conversation around mental health, the designated agencies, the roles in the schools provide, and sort of that relationship next week.
Good.
And so whoever in this room wants to hop across the hall for that one.
Great.
We're gonna really try to have a multiple committee approach on it.
Right, that's great. One of the things that I learned in my preparation to talk to you today, and again, I have people with me, we were talking about the loss of learning. And one of the participants in the conversation said, Jeff, it really doesn't do justice to the loss that we experienced as a result of COVID by referring to it as loss of learning. It was really a loss of community, was how it was characterized. Because when you think about what the learning process is, a lot of it goes well past learning in the classic sense to how students mature in schools and societally by exposure to classroom experience. And COVID caused us to lose that. And what schools are grappling with now, both through the learning that they impart to students, but also socialization, maturity, the sort of the whole student side of the educational process was lost during COVID, and we're still trying to catch up. And when you think about the fact that those needs may manifest themselves in the requirement for mental health supports for students, if those supports don't exist outside of the school or to supplement what the school is doing, that's a real need. When you think about the fact that we've got 120 or so school boards who are contending with that as an issue very prominently, it's not surprising that money is being added to budgets in order to contend with that factor. The fourth specific example that I wanted to cite was the implications of the loss of federal ESSER monies, which, while provided as one-time federal revenues intended to support schools and communities in an array of varying investments, with the loss of those federal resources.
Which were for learning loss, right?
Right. Yeah, and a variety of other investments. But the point is that the federal funds that were in support of those efforts went away, but in certain school districts around the state, and this also is variable, there's a need to maintain those investments. So we were always concerned about the ESSER cliff, and we talked with school districts about the need to, we cautioned against the need of making investments that needed to be sustained over time when the revenues went away. some districts have decided that they need to sustain those investments, and they're doing that. We think that that's a factor in the increase in school district budgets this year. It didn't make the list of 4, but, and this will not come as any surprise to legislators, there's also a cost pressure that we're seeing arise as a result of the increased focus on school facility improvements and the need for enhanced stewardship. So just in the last couple of years, there's been a greatly increased focus on school facilities. And that is because in Vermont, I would say there's an extraordinary need to modernize our school facilities. Act 72 spoke directly to that. The recent assessment of school facilities in Vermont that was part of Act 72 provides evidence that that needs to be done. And right now, the School Construction Aid Task Force is underway, getting ready to produce at the end of this month a big report on the need for reinvestment and perhaps some strategies to do so around school construction and school facilities. There's a lot of districts in Vermont who have not been able to invest in their school facilities, and they have chosen now as the time to do that. And some of those decisions were made relative to perceptions around increased tax capacity associated with Act 127. And in other instances, they just decided, that they needed to get ahead of it because it's something that hasn't been tended to as regularly as we all would have hoped over the last couple of decades. So school facilities is an issue that we'd ask you consider in terms of the cost pressures on school districts generally.
And do you include PCBs and water quality in that whole?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. I'll speak to that a little bit later. But the answer to the question is yes. In fact, I'm going to speak to it right now. Another factor, so when I had folks vet this testimony, one person made a comment and said, we understand the purpose is to go to the General Assembly and talk about pressing cost needs in the FY25 budget cycle. Please also mention to them that in the field, we're aware that the Ed Fund not only responds to what local school districts are doing with respect to the expenditures that they're responding to, but also it is a catchment area for priorities of the General Assembly. And there were 2 prominent ones last year that you all recall, because there was significant debate around both of them. One was the $29 million that went into universal school meals. And the other was the $29.7 million that went in for PCB remediation. So each of those goes to a different category, but it's $60 million in expenditure. The Ed Fund outlook that you looked at has no money in FY25 for PCBs. And I saw that the amount for universal school meals went from 29 million to 26.5 million. And after all the deliberation and debate that went into both of those, I'm not going to comment on the purpose or the efficacy of either, but they were heavily debated and they were additive in terms of the cost pressures on the Ed Fund. So, I wouldn't sit here and say that's not the General Assembly's prerogative to do that, but I would say that anytime a decision is made to add a cost to the education fund, one-time money or not, it creates a future complication when you have to consider funding not only what's transpiring at the local level, but also programs and priorities that you set yourself. And I think that, FY25 really is a tremendous illustration of that, because there was one-time money available. You passed what I consider to be very responsible public policy with respect to Act 127. And now we're dealing with not only the cost pressures, the use of one-time money, but also some of the implementation challenges of Act 127, which I'd pause and say again is legislation that is purposeful and we supported. But it's all adding up into one heck of a budget year that's putting pressure on everybody. And, that I think we'll be talking about in future Tuesdays. So what I say here is that those 2 factors, so I talked then about, and I just referenced them, more useful, I would say, complicating factors. One is the implementation of the weighting changes that are associated with the modifications to the education funding system, which I'll add for the third time we supported. And the second is the dramatic change in many communities' common levels of appraisal, right? So there's a lot, this is a year that I think could be fairly characterized as somewhat in flux because of dynamics and the way they've all come together. So I mentioned that. I then, and I'm now back to my testimony, what I write is that despite the transition provisions included in 127, school districts are contending with both predicted effects of the law and the unanticipated effects that are reflective of extraordinary cost pressures. So I think it's worth noting that on the Act 127 side, one of the phenomenon that we're contending with is that school districts that are under the modeling gaining tax capacity have seen that tax capacity diminish because of the effects of the CLA. And there are folks in the room with me today that can comment on that. And then I say in a different category, but contributing significantly to budgeting pressures are also the effects of the dramatic rise in property values over the last several years. And that, you know, one experience that I had was when the equalization study came out on January 1st, I had probably half a dozen calls from superintendents who were like, what, you know, what's happening here? And some of them, and I say this with all due respect to them and all parties involved, they're conflating prominent factors like the changes in weights and the changes in property values. They connect them when, in my judgment, the only way they can be connected is in the cost pressures and perceptions of cost pressures that are being brought because they're different. One has to do with the change in tax capacity that we knew was coming as a result of the implementation of Act 127. And the other one has to do, I refer to it as a legacy factor, which is the change in property values that play out differently from community to community in terms of how their tax rates are affected once you apply the CLA. So that is a factor and phenomenon that we're contending with right now. I give an example here because I spoke with her this morning. Amy Miner is the superintendent in the Colchester School District. I talked with her this morning and she told me that of the 15% tax rate increase that they are seeing in that district, 75% is attributable to the change in the CLA. Now, I talked to Julia Richter today and I talked with Morgan Daybell, who's well-versed in this. Some of the increases in tax rate would be happening irrespective of CLA changes, but you know, what happens is the equalization study gets released. They look at what happens to their CLA. They apply it to their budget process, and it's a shocking result because they're seeing an increase in property taxes that they, in many instances, hadn't anticipated that dramatically.
And I think we're going to have a chance to maybe go deeper on that with Jake or Julia about how the tax rate itself takes into account that CLA.
Right. So the last thing I say is that, and this is really the way I started, it's the most challenging budget development cycle that I've witnessed in recent years. I think it's fair to say that local school officials are more concerned about the prospect for budget failures in March than we would typically see. And they're more concerned not only about budget failures, but about what's going to happen when and if their budgets do fail, right? So in recent years, we've only seen a handful of budget defeats. I think that I don't want to forecast what the result will be this year because I have a lot of confidence in the ability of local school officials to communicate to their electorates what's happening and why. But there's no question that there's an immense amount of pressure on everybody right now as a result of what's transpired for FY25. So we are going to do our best to make sure that local school officials can do their best to communicate what's happening to local taxpayers. But it is a budget year like I think we haven't seen in a long time if we've ever seen something quite like this. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about this. I got a little twisted because I was using my brain and what's on the paper. That always happens to me. But I hope I made the points that I wanted to make, and I'm happy to answer questions, and the folks who are with me I know will answer questions too.
I have one question to kick us off. You talked about the variability between districts this year in terms of some really substantial growth in spending and some substantial reduction in spending. And I'm curious how that compares to the range we've seen in past years, if it's usually a tighter range.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that question, but I think if I may, you'll get the call on them. On my right, Brad might have some insight on that, and on my left, Morgan might.
I'm gonna ask Morgan because Brad's gonna have his own chance to be sitting in them.
So I don't
And if
have.
Morgan, you could introduce yourself for the record.
Sure. For the record, my name is Morgan Diddle. I'm the president of the Vermont Association of School Business Officials. In terms of the question on how that compares to prior years, I would guess that that's a bigger range. I don't have any data that would back that up. And I think one of the things that we're seeing this year is that the information that I gathered was per pupil spending and the prescale rate tax rate, and both of those are impacted by the new way of our county pupils. So that may be part of it.
Scott, did you?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. Thanks for coming in, Jeff. One is the comment about universal school meals, PCB remediation, costs that are now in the education fund without corresponding revenue source. And I would just point out for everybody that the legislature has made decisions in the last 5 years that have increased the consumption taxes available to the education fund by about twice what those programs cost, 38%. So I would argue we have provided the revenues to cover those programs. But just for a question for you, do you think out in the field, to the superintendents, to the school boards, do they understand that when the state CLA is going down like it is right now, that benefit rolls back into the yield, which helps their tax rate? I mean, there's a circle, it's not all bad. Do they understand that?
I think some do and some probably don't. I mean, if you go back to my probably tedious explanation of the education delivery system locally, 120 school boards, 56 superintendents, 56 business managers. When you consider, I would say more so, well, anybody in that set, there is a wide range of understanding. So as I've listened to local school officials explain the current dynamics, you'll get people who are really confident that they understand it, and then people who will challenge them, and quickly you find yourself questioning yourself in terms of what the understanding is. In terms of your first point, if I may respond to that, I understand what happened with consumption taxes, and I know that in some instances, the motivation to change those taxes wasn't necessarily, in my recollection, that the state was going to add new programs. I think that the money materialized, but my response to your point would be, okay, that's great. But if we doubled the investment that was required for PCBs and universal school meals, then you're at a point where you've consumed all of the money that you added. And if you double it again, it's like, okay. And, I realize the way I operate is to stay friends with everybody. I mean, it's because we need one another in terms of working through this. But I do, but it is true that the perception of the field is that sometimes like everybody's looking at them. What are you doing? Why don't you have a handle on this? And I say that we all are participants both in, in where we are. So
Everyone's looking at it that way.
yeah. I mean, I respect your point, but I think it's also a legitimate point for me to raise, I guess is what I would say.
Towards that question or a conversation. I do think that we sort of go back and forth with costs being carried by the ed fund or by the districts. You know, school meals were carried by the districts unevenly until we moved to universal system. Special ed costs and what happened with special education reform. I'm curious what you all are hearing about how costs might be shifting to extraordinary, is that the technical term? It's like so hard to me that that's technical. To extraordinary spending, if that's happening at the district level in order to move more costs to the state, to the
Yeah.
statewide fund, or if we see our costs going up related to the pandemic. Well,
Yeah, I can't respond to that, but maybe, I'm not sure whether Morgan or Libby can, or Mark Tucker.
I'm happy to give it a go from Montpelier Roxbury's experience. I would say.
Will you identify yourself?
Yes, I'm Libby Balso, superintendent of Montpelier Roxbury. In terms of our special education costs, yes, they are increasing. We are identifying more students with special needs across our district, and so that obviously increases costs. I would also say that with Act 173, that requires a multi-tiered system of support model. That increases costs because all the interventionists that people added through ESSER funding weren't just add extra positions. Like the idea that we've added extra positions, I think, is a false narrative. They were necessary positions that ESSER allowed us to add quickly, right, because of the money. And so now we have an MTSS model that we have to implement because our students have so many needs in both SEL and in academics. And we need those positions. You know, it's not like we added people we didn't need and now we can get rid of them, you know, because they support a system that is supporting our students. So that's an added cost, with not necessarily directly tied to special education, but it is through a multi-tiered system of support that's required by 173. In terms of extraordinary costs, and it's going to sound strange for me to say this, but because of the high cost of educating some of our very high need students, we're almost rewarded for hitting that extraordinary cost mechanism because we get there.
I just found out from the education committee that they can't hear anything when one of you on the bench.
Oh, wow.
I'm so sorry.
Shall I allow them to?
Given that, so sorry, it took me a minute to see my text message from the education committee. I'm wondering, Scott, if you could move your briefcase and Mr. Mattos's chair could be given over to anyone who wants to hop up.
Sure.
Thank you.
Do you want to come up? I mean, I don't know whether you wanted to repeat it or not. It's up to you.
I think it'll be helpful, yeah.
Try to do it the same way.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to make it. It was so smart, education committee, you don't even know. Okay, so in regards.
Excuse me, Angela, we were able to hear that okay, but we really appreciate you coming up to the table. It helps tremendously. Thank you.
So I'll just finish up with the extraordinary costs. There are certain students that cost a significant amount of money to educate that our systems are not our systems aren't set up or designed for, which happen, then the extraordinary cost kicks in. However, in Montpelier Roxbury this year's budget season, we got significantly more revenue, special education revenue, than we were actually expecting because of that extraordinary cost threshold that we hit. And we hit it at a higher rate than we typically do. So it's a, give and take in terms of special education needs and how we identify kids and specifically higher needs students, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Add on to that, Morgan?
Thanks.
Sure.
And if we could move the chair to the end of the table next to Jeff.
Okay.
Keep us all protocol.
So I would echo everything that Libby said, and I would add to it that in our district, we've seen a decrease in extraordinary costs because we can't find placements for kids. And so I believe that under Act 173, the funding formula does reimburse districts at a higher rate than we'd seen prior to that. I don't see any way that districts are necessarily adding costs to a single kid to trigger more revenue.
Okay,
That makes sense.
it's sort of incentivizing, that we somehow created a incentive that we didn't mean to in the way we should. Okay, thank you. I'm sure there's a lot more to say about Act 173. We're gonna get to today. Okay.
I find it interesting that there are children that our public schools cannot educate. I guess, do they get sent to independent schools? Like how that works?
Well, I heard an example yesterday. Come on up, Libby. I heard an example yesterday. So yesterday, I hosted a meeting on H409, which is a prohibition on restraint and seclusion. It's a bill that was introduced by Representative Wood with 32 co-sponsors. I'd be surprised if there wasn't some co-sponsors in this room. And the conversation went for 2 hours. And at one point in the conversation, a special ed director from a school district in Southern Vermont talked about the fact that they had a student or students that they were educating that they had sought an out-of-district placement for in 30 different potential settings and was refused. They couldn't find a place for it. And that person came back to, that student is now being educated by the district. So I think, and Libby will have an educator's response to this. My response to Representative Beck's question is that the school district has an obligation to educate that student in a least restrictive environment. And I don't think that the students that were being referred to are students whose destination might be independent schools. I think it's students whose destination would be specialized schools. And those placements are not as available as they have been historically. I think that was Mr. Daybell's point.
I think we have the same amount of placements with a greater need. And they are very specialized schools for that are highly trained in behavioral techniques mostly is what we are working on.
I'm going to keep us on cost pressures here and leave it to the education committee when we're not here to talk about.
Just a clarifying question. I think I heard you say you have about the same amount of placements, but those placements have more acute needs. Is that what you were
We
saying?
have more students meeting those placements.
Thank you.
So the placements haven't grown at all. The number of placements haven't grown, yeah.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Rob, thank you. Mr. Tucker? Oh, you're muted, I think.
not muted, but can't hear.
But we're not able to hear you.
You hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. The students that we put in so-called alternative placements, which tend to be high expense placements, are students primarily, and I don't mean to be pejorative, but they're primarily with mental health, students with mental health needs. And this goes to the question or the point that Jeff was making in his testimony of how much money we spend in the public school system, so to speak, on mental health needs. I can tell you in looking at our projected FY25 special education budget for the entire supervisory union, that totals about $4.9 million. A conservative estimate of that is that 30% of that budget is going to high cost students who are in alternative placements. And as a corollary of that, a big chunk of what we spend on specialized placements because of where we are in the state of Vermont and the Northeast Kingdom actually gets absorbed by transportation costs. So I've had students that have cost us $90,000 a year to transport to and from an alternative placement because there are not sufficient placements in the region that I'm in, and I'm transporting students to Barrie from Barnet, for just to make an example, and at $90,000 a year because we don't have any other way to get the students there. This, in my opinion, is a direct reflection of the fact that we continue to have to absorb costs for mental health services because there's not a good mental health system in the state of Vermont that's oriented towards meeting the needs of our youth. And I know in another a meeting last week, there was a discussion about some increased focus on mental health needs for adults, but I would argue that we're making more we're building more adults that are going to end up in the adult mental health system if we don't deal with their problems when they're youth. And and this is a problem that's been going on for a long time, ever since I got into school leadership. These are kids with growing up in difficult homes with trauma backgrounds. We try everything that we can to educate them in our school before we consider placing them elsewhere, because A, we don't want them out of our school community, and B, it's very expensive to deal with them. But I'll give you one last quick example, and then I'll stop talking about this. In the Caledonia Cooperative School District meeting last night, they don't vote until April, so we were just getting around the preliminary budget discussions with them. They are looking at an $800,000 increase in special education costs next year for that district. It's a 3-school district, and $600 of that $800,000 is related to high-cost specialized placements for students that were not in the budget last year.
Thank you. I think for each of these 8 factors that you named, Jeff, we could have at least a full day of testimony on them. So I just want to acknowledge how profoundly surface level these really deep and complex issues are today. We're really just sort of trying to get a broad view so we know what to dig into going forward. Does anyone on the education committee have questions for Jeff? Want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll ask one and then I'll throw it out to the rest of the committee. Jeff, I think one of our concerns, one of the reasons why we have the 5% cap on tax rate increases as a part of Act 127 is to sort of help with the transition to the new pupil weights. That almost seems like a minor event compared with all of the other issues you've laid out that are upward pressures on education spending. And I guess I'd be interested to know if we didn't have 127 in place, and more importantly, if we didn't have the 5% tax rate cap in place, what would the landscape look like without that?
I think it's a great question, which I'm going to look to, if I may, look to the practitioners to respond to. And I'll stand there and relinquish my seat, but I'll come back also. So go ahead.
Oh, he's going to leave both chairs. That's nice. You're coming with me? Sure. So Morgan and I can talk.
And I want to just add, I think this has been the most rumor-filled part of our testimony today. And I just want to thank you for sort of stepping into that great gulf of rumors that we were all.
I didn't know Morgan before this budget season, and now I feel like he's my best friend. So we've been at this for a while. I don't know if there's a specific answer to that question because it is in place, right? So we're talking about assumptions, not reality. I can say that the 5% cap is directly influencing the dollar yield in an unprecedented and way that we can't really predict. We're putting new pressures on the education fund that we haven't in the past because of the difference between the 5% and what budgets need, right? That's going to be more than our taxes bring in. And so that is going to impact the education fund in a considerable way that we can make educated guesses about, but we can't say exactly how it will. And so that is a piece that over the next 5 years, while that cap is in play, will need to be addressed. And I can pick on Jake Feldman, who's one of my school board members, as well as a tax aficionado. It's a conversation that we are having a lot at our school board meetings, and how do we anticipate and how do we strategize and how do we plan for the next 5 years with that cap in place and what it will do to the education fund and thus what will happen to the dollar yield because of it.
Yeah, I would say that in my 2 district meetings, we've been talking a lot about the 5% because we will not hit it. And we know that because whoever does hit it is going to push the yield down, that ultimately in these 5 years, we're going to be paying for it. That said, we don't know how many districts are out there that are going to need the cap yet, and we're not going to know that until March or April.
Right. So in 5 years, there's the potential where it doesn't matter if you're disadvantaged or advantaged by this law. If the yield is considerably lower, then all of us will be in the same boat, experiencing a significant tax increase.
Thank you.
Representative?
Thank you. So I don't know, would everybody really be in the same boat? Or if you were at 5%, if some schools are at 5% and some are not, would they have an incentive to reach the 5 so that they would not be contributing to help those who are at 5?
Whether or not there's an incentive to reach the 5 is something that is being widely debated at the moment. If my district who needs to increase our tax capacity to have the same services, so in other words, was disadvantaged by 127, if we don't reach the 5% cap, then we could never go back on that team again. Then we've lost eligibility for it. So in a way that protects us for the next 5 years, which was the intent behind that. If we don't need it, then we won't go there. But it does give us some protection. Districts will go there. That's a given. Districts will go there. How many, I don't know. And making up the difference between what you need in the ed fund and what our general budgets are after that 5% will have an impact on Morgan's district, who was advantaged by 127.
And I will promise everyone in this room that we will definitely spend more time on the 5% threshold before the month is out.
And since we're here.
Yeah,
I guess
it wasn't I wasn't trying to deter you from speaking. I just wanted to make sure that this was everyone.
I'm sure you could anyway. Could you talk a little bit about what you're hearing and seeing within your districts around the cap at 5% and the review beginning at 10%, and whether that creates any incentives or interesting conversations about if you're already at 6% and there isn't a review until 10, how that's playing out?
There's a lot of conversation about it.
And not in my district because we're not close to that 5% cap. I have heard anecdotal stories about people moving to the 10%, paying attention to the 10% in both directions. So both we can add money, it won't increase our tax rate because, as Jeff pointed out earlier, we're all looking at our schools for PCBs. We know there's no money there to take care of that. On top of we haven't been taking care of our facilities for a long time. And so isn't it prudent for those districts to start budgeting for that? I've also heard from people who are saying, I can justify my increase. We're well over that 5%, but I don't want to take a risk with a tax committee. So we're cutting things out of our budget that have been in there historically, maybe not really tied to the Act 127, but they're making cuts so that they don't have to risk losing that for their taxpayers. And you'll probably get 56 different answers on how people are dealing with that across the state.
Do we know whether more schools are going to be looking for construction bonds and the kind of debt service that they might have to pay is increased?
I don't have the answer to that other than what has happened in recent history where the majority of the large bonds that I've seen have failed. South Burlington, Stowe, those going out to the voters to ask for the large bonds have failed. So that may impact how people are thinking about going back to the 5 to 10%, 5% and 10% piece. I don't know if that really answers your question, I'm sorry.
Anything from the Education Committee? And then I think we're going to go to our next witness.
There we go. Okay, thanks. I had to get the unmute button working here. One quick question. Morgan, could you tell us what your school districts are that you work with? We're a little bit, having heard so much sort of out there in the field, to hear somebody say you're not going to hit the 5% cap is kind of remarkable. We're curious what districts are yours?
Maybe we can get you to come up and tell our voters that in a couple of weeks. Franklin Northeast has 2 districts. Enosburg has Enosburg and Richford. And Northern Mountain Valley has Bakersfield, Berkshire, Montgomery, and Sheldon.
Thank you. And we do have a question from Representative Austin.
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm wondering about, and this is from a very high level, looking at how 173 was anticipated or kind of promoted that it would lower special ed costs. And that if we negotiated at a state level for healthcare, it would lower costs. And if we consolidated schools, it would lower costs. And I'm wondering, how do we tell this story, to our citizens, our constituents? I know it's very complicated, and I know there are forces, that are beyond everybody's control, but I don't think the public understands how the kind of complexity that's going on here. And, over the past, I think, 10 years, they've been kind of hoping that these initiatives would lower taxes.
So I can take a stab.
I mean, I don't know, I don't know what the answer is. It's just, how do we frame this for people?
I think that's a really good question.
173 is not a quick fix. I think when done well, we will get there with 173, and we will start to see some cost containment when MTSS models are really up and running. We tend to forget pretty quickly that schools went through one heck of a pandemic, as everybody did, and expect results right away outside of the pandemic. It's just not, we don't work on automobiles, we work with children who are very different and unique. And so I think 173 gives some time perhaps, and let us work with our systems that we're developing here. I think consolidation also could have some impact. And I am speaking way out of my expertise line here, but Act 146 has not come to fruition the way that it was intended. And there's very little teeth right now in that law. And I'm looking at Jeff to see if he's not nodding or anything, so he's probably disagreeing with me in his head. But the Act 146 is not having, it's having some unintended consequences right now with school districts. Act 46, sorry, thank you. That nobody anticipated. Schools unmerging, for instance, and school districts trying to go out on their own. So that's having the opposite effect than what it was intended to do. And then healthcare is again, I think, a lot of pandemic situation that people avoided healthcare while we were in that aspect, and now they're doing it, right? Now they're having the surgeries and that kind of thing. So I think that has an impact. And I'm also hearing about weight loss drugs that are having major impacts on our healthcare that Vermont Public has been talking about quite a bit. So I think healthcare is a different coin. I don't know if we'll ever see the impact of that. However, I think that we also didn't, and I think that came into play at a time when we've got some significant curveballs being thrown at us.
I appreciate you bringing us back to both how that the impacts of the pandemic are still very much with us and very much with you all in schools in a very real way, and that is a reason for a lot of these cost pressures. I'd appreciate if you, as you go back to your districts and homes, to be thinking about how bills like 173 and 46 that were designed to make schools both more effective and lower costs long-term, which is kind of a magic thing to try to do simultaneously. What the state or the Board of Education or the Agency of Education or the legislature could do to really help us realize those goals in the next few years. I think that's going to be a big part of our work ahead.
I need to follow up Libby's comment on Act 46.
I didn't say something right.
Before you follow up on Act 46, I just want to sort of level set a little bit. We're talking about sort of who's above and below the 5% threshold. We don't even know what our tax rates are. We haven't set the yield yet. So we have the modeling from when we first passed the weighting bill. We have modeling based on the December 1st letter. We don't know what the budgets will be. Sort of the percentage of districts above and below that 5% is a constantly changing projection and not necessarily something that we can have definitive data on, which is what makes this conversation so much more challenging and interesting.
I'll be very succinct on the Act 46 point. So I think that that the question and Libby's response are both indicative of the point I was making about the variable effects of laws in the current configuration, right? So if you devoted an afternoon, and I'm not suggesting that you do so, but if you or the House Education Committee devoted time to Act 46, I could bring in witness after superintendent witness who would talk about the advantages that they gained in their education system educationally and from a standpoint of cost centers and how those cost centers are playing out under merged districts. I think what Libby was inferring, and if I put inappropriate words in your mouth, Libby, you should speak up. In her own district, Montpelier-Roxbury, their challenge, it's a well-reported fact in the media of what the costs are of sustaining the Roxbury school, which I believe is part of your articles of agreement. Is that true?
It was.
Okay. But
We certainly don't need to relitigate.
yeah, we're not going to. But the point is.
I do have a board member.
Yeah, I know. But the point is, I think that many superintendents would say that that Act 46 might not have gone far enough in terms of the teeth associated with the law that wouldn't let school districts withdraw. But in general, I think that we can provide testimony that would say aggregating districts into a single district, governing that district under a single board, and utilizing the resources that previously were serving, 3, 4, 5, or 6 districts into a larger yet still small district that had opportunity to options with regard to how they managed it was useful both from a cost standpoint and educational standpoint. I think one of the phenomenon that we're dealing with is what we talked about in terms of the effects of things like the pandemic, the economy, the job market, the cost of housing, which really are limiting factors in terms of what school district operations, how school district operations are carried out. So I think Libby was right, but there was a side to that I wanted to make sure I put on the table.
Thank you. Yes,
Yeah, I would just comment, when Act 46 was expected to save up to $15 million statewide. The real benefits that were what you just talked about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
It wasn't going to save the education fund.
I think with that, I will thank you so much.
Appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to future Tuesdays. Thank you.
Mark, I'm sorry I missed your hand. Would you like to have the last word on this? Oh, you know what? Oh, he just dropped off. Okay, great. Okay. I think now we're going to hear from the Agency of Education. Would you both like to come up together?
I think so.
Okay, great.
We can do that.
I understand that your secretary was invited and is not able to make it and sends her regrets, and we send our well wishes to her. And Ms. Lee, I want to welcome you to, I think it's your first time testifying in our committee.
Yes.
We're very glad to have you. Welcome. So we'll spend lots of time together.
Thank you.
So what do you think is going on?
Well, first of all, Brad James, Agency of Education, outgoing education director, education finance director. Nicole Lee, incoming education finance director. And yes, I mean, I think Heather would have come here with prepared remarks. We did not. We thought we were coming to more or less answer questions. But I think what's going on is that listening. I'm sorry, Nicole, I'm taking over. I did not mean to. I was intending to let her do the talking.
You still have a chance.
I'm not very good at that. But I think listening to Jeff and Libby and Morgan and Mark, I think they kind of gave you a good flavor from what we've been hearing. Nicole's heard a lot more about the pupil counts than I have because I kind of turned that part over to her, and I'll let her kind of get you up to speed on where the pupil count end.
So the fifth version of preliminary pupils went out yesterday. We consider now 50 of the 52 LEAs frozen for fiscal year 25.
By LEA supervisory unions.
Sorry, yeah, supervisory unions. And so I just have a couple of trends that I noted, and that is, so when we think about 24 restated pupils, we had about.
What's a restated pupil?
Yep. It is, we took the 24 data and we applied the Act 127 weights, and we're calling those restated 24 pupils.
And by 24, you mean data from this
fiscal year, last year.
The data that we use for FY24 equalized pupils, which actually came from FY23, because we work a year in advance, so a year behind in advance. But what we did was we took, as Nicole said, we took the numbers that we use for FY24 equalized pupils and then reran them with the best information we had through the Act 127 formula. And that's what we have for the restated FY24 pupils, which is what we needed to do to get that spending, FY24 spending per pupil. People are comparing their FY25 spending per pupil against for the 10% increase.
I'm about to go really deep into what you're saying, and I'm realizing that I am running this meeting. And so I would love to step back for a minute from how we're counting students and what counts as students we're applying weights to. And if you two, as a pair representing the Agency of Education, just want to spend a few moments talking about why you think our tax rates are projected to be what they are and why you think education spending is what it is, that would be great. And then maybe we can go deep for a while.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So if we talk about why education spending is increasing, we're hearing it's the 5 reasons Jeff had mentioned. So that is inflation, it's collective bargaining, it's capital needs built into the budgets. And so what we had done is taken an informal poll. Effectively, we asked all of the business managers to provide a percent increase that they thought that their budgets would increase. This was back in late October, early November. So it's pre-board approval. And what we did is, for those that replied, and we had 83 of 122 districts reply, so pretty good response rate. We applied the average increase to anyone who didn't respond of those 83. So of those 83, we saw 12%, so we applied 12% to the other 38. And that's where we came up with the 12% spending.
Why do you think people are spending the money?
I think as Jeff listed those things, and from what I heard from business managers when we were asking these questions, was a lot of it's inflation. I was told by someone that wood chips have almost doubled in price, if not more so, and a number of school districts are heating by wood chips. We have collective bargaining, which has gone up for good reasons quite often, because a lot of districts, Morgan's being one of them, have teachers who come in and they will get some experience, then go somewhere else where the pay is higher. So there's places like that are increasing their salaries. There's that 16.4% healthcare increase that automatically adds money to people's budgets. I don't know what the impact of the ESSER ending is, because we just don't know that. But I'm hearing anecdotally from the business managers that has also played in certain districts, not everywhere, but in certain districts, as Libby said, that they have investments that they want to keep.
I feel like everyone in this room, to one degree or another, has been swirling in a lot of anecdotal information about all of this. You two full-time, and some of us part-time, and I'm so desperate to go to get to more concrete information in some ways. I know we have not succeeded in our common charter of accounts, and I feel sad about that this month, though. Such is life. But I'm wondering, so I asked a question of the previous witnesses about the how much you've seen budgets go up year over year, separate from education spending, and I wonder if you have, is that number available?
Off the top of my head, Nicole won't have this, but off the top of my head, I'd say that probably year over year budgets go up on average 4 to 5%. Would be my off the top of my head
And is this year
estimate.
4 or 5%?
No, this year's significantly higher. Last year, I believe, was just over 8%. And really, I'm thinking in terms of education spending as opposed to
Oh, I'm wondering about budgets.
yeah, I'm okay. And so, but I believe last year was roughly around 8%. But for budgets, it was probably more like 7% in that case. This year, again, we were only interested in education spending, so we asked that's that 12.4% number came from. We will have better information about the actual increases in pretty early February, because as Jeff said, I think it was Jeff said, that budgets are going to be warned soon.
Okay.
And at that point, then people will be kind of fixed numbers. That's when we start collecting information and the preliminary budget information and bringing numbers in before town meeting. And that's when we start coming in and reporting to you, or I have in the past, in years past, come in and start reporting to you. Here's what we're hearing from the districts, and here's what we're seeing compared to what we estimated back for the December 1 letter.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm curious whether you have, or as you come in more and as we look to the future, will we be talking not only about averages, but also, looking for trends across different groups? I mean, I think in particular, I'm curious about how the changes in weights are impacting historically under and overweighted communities. And, if we're at 12% average, is that consistent across those communities who are seeing really big changes in their tax capacity? Or are some, tightening belts as they've lost tax capacity, and those who we've, trying to help make up for lack of access to resources in the past, taking advantage of that? I feel like to kind of understand what is across everyone and what might be unique to some of the different.
Yeah, I'll speak if you don't mind, because you're going to have to do it. I think it's a great idea to start looking at people as information comes in. We have the historical information. This is what they've done in the past. Right now, we don't know. We have very, very rough ideas back from October, November. But again, as we move forward, we'll start. And so there may be trends that will develop. I don't know at this point. It's too early to say, but it's easy enough to follow something like that.
Do you currently have any data about how many schools we expect to be at or above the 5% cap?
The best we would have would be based on the information that we collected back in October, November. And I would not put much stock in that information.
Is that information we'll have moving forward?
We will. Once we start collecting information on the preliminary budget collection, again, towards the end of this month, early February, we'll have a better idea of what's going on as to how many people are going to look
Yeah,
like it.
definitely.
Again, we'll be using the December 1 letter's values. Or I think Julia came up with a new value. Whichever one people prefer us to use, we'll use. So.
But when we set the yield, who's at the 5%, what districts are at the 5% or not 5% will change based on how we actually set this.
That's right. That's correct.
It's a deeply dynamic model for good reason, but it's.
It is, and it's a two-pronged model, because if you're over the 5% for your tax rate, you're capped at 5%. But if you're spending per pupil compared to that restated FY24 spending per pupil is over 10%, that's where you get that tax rate review. And we'll know that number right after town meeting when we hear what budget results are.
And
for sure.
I'm very eager to understand what the total cost of the above 5% spending is that the rest of the system will have to.
So are we.
Very forward.
We'll have a better idea after town meeting. That will give us a rough idea.
Two questions. Wanted to zero in on the healthcare a little bit. The ESSER employees, the employees that were brought in that pay with extra monies. Is it fair to assume that their healthcare premiums were being paid with ESSER monies as well?
I would actually turn that question over. Then my answer would be yes, but I don't know. But both Libby and Morgan are nodding yes.
So we've got two things going on here. One, we've got a 16.4% increase, and then we've also got people that the state of Vermont wasn't paying for their health care, and now it's in education spending. My second question is about this restated pupil, okay? And we've talked about that a couple times over the phone, but is there anything that logistically, like what prevents your office from actually using the 25 pupil counts that we just had in the identification? What prevents you from using 25 instead of 24?
The law.
The law.
The law.
Okay, but
As you pass Act 127.
So I don't want to get too presumptuous here, but I mean, if we change that to Act 127 weights on 125, on FY 25 pupils, I mean.
And then apply that against the FY 24 education spending?
No, I'm talking about FY 25.
Okay, so.
I'm talking about keeping everything in FY 25. Is that impossible or?
If you want a comparison in terms of putting some potential restraint on people spending, yes, I think it is possible. I think you have to look at the prior year. As a comparison, which is what I think, which is what you all did 2 years ago when you passed Act 127. You basically what you did was you said, if a district gets that 5% cap, their tax rate is higher than 5%, they're capped at that 5%. But if their spending per pupil increases by 10% or more from the prior year, then they get a review. And if there's good cause as to why they have that increase, then they keep the 5% and move forward. If there's not good cause, then they don't get the 5%, their tax rate goes up to wherever it should be.
I guess I'm thinking more of along the lines of, my thoughts are along the lines of students that are identified as poverty. Because in FY 25,
there are more.
Right, we have a whole bunch of different ways to capture it, hopefully more accurately. But we're using the 24. So
I understand your question better now.
Even yes. If you, in answering Scott, can back up slightly to finish what I cut you off from explaining before, because I realized I was about to go. Which was exactly this. I'm just saying, back up and explain the whole thing instead of just answering Scott's.
So if I back way back to what we did for FY24, forget Act 127, forget FY25, or just an FY24, which was current law. I guess it still is, come to think of it. We calculated equalized pupils. When we calculated equalized pupils, we had fewer factors, lower factors, and lower weights, I should say. And we used the statutorily prescribed definition for poverty counts. And that was students aged 6 through 17 reported to, and living with families receiving nutritional benefits, reported to us by DCF. That's what we've used historically up until now. Before Act 127 was put into place, and when the task of Act 127 task force was meeting, was that summer of 21? And I don't remember when it was. Whenever that task force was meeting, we started talking about using free and reduced lunch counts as a proxy for whatever we were going to do for poverty. And so that's what we started doing. That's what I started doing the modeling on back then. And what happened is, as we rolled forward and came closer to FY25, the way Act 127 reads now is that FY24 pupil counts need to be restated under the best we can do under Act 127 weights and definitions. And this is, I think, where we stopped. So what we did, and the reason we did that is because the law has that comparison in there. It compares FY25 per pupil increase, if there is one, to what that restated FY24 education spending per pupil is. So it's not what your tax rate in FY24 is based on. That was spending per equalized people. This is spending per long-term ADM before you go to equalized people. So it's a larger number. So a larger pupil number, I should say. So what we did was we ran through the information we had for student data that we use for FY24 equalized pupils. everything worked fairly well except poverty, because we used a different poverty count. And that's where we used the best poverty information we had at that time for FY24, which was reported on the student census and through, basically on the student census as students eligible for free and reduced lunch. So that number was significantly higher than we'd used before, but it's also significantly lower than what we're using for FY25 because we developed more.
And so are you using the FY24 just to compare FY24 and 25 for the purposes of checking the 10% cap, or are you using the FY24 for the purposes of calculating FY25 tax rates?
Solely for comparing the 10%.
No, I think there's massive confusion about that answer in the.
I think part of it is also that there's.
So for FY25 tax rates, you are using
FY25 information.
FY25 ADM and FY25 weights.
Yes.
That ADM.
I think the other part of the confusion, and Nicole's hearing this, I've heard this, is that people realize that our two poverty counts that we used for restating FY24 are not the same as FY24. It's far more robust for FY25.
Yeah.
And they want us to go back and recalculate. Well, that would be problematical in several ways. One, we're not set up to do that. People would have to go back a year to find that information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But assuming that can be done, what that would actually disadvantage districts. Because what would happen is you've got the same spending and you now have, with an increased poverty, you now have a larger denominator. So your spending per pupil goes down. That means more people are going to hit that 10% threshold. It doesn't make sense to do it. We also aren't set up to do it. But I think that's the second part to that question. But when we're doing FY25 tax rates, we're using solely FY25 information.
Great. I have one more question. When you're counting students who are English language learners, are you using students who are in the monitoring category for English language learners?
No, we're not.
Okay.
So when we.
How was that decision made?
When we looked at ESSA, so the federal regulation, and we looked at the Vermont State Plan, and they discuss students testing out of English language learning as exiting the program or no longer being in that active status. And Act 127 discusses that provision. And so active ELL is not monitoring. And that's how the decision was made. And I just want to provide one clarifying point because this has caused a lot of confusion. So when we say 25, 25, 25 being the basis for all of the data, right, we have the 2-year average. So that's 23 and 24 ADM that are guiding 25 pupils. When we talk about ELL and FPL, that's 24 counts, fiscal year 24, fall 23, that are guiding 25. There was a lot of confusion and trepidation earlier in the process about what year or 2 years was guiding what count for what time period.
Thank you. And we, committee, we're going to have a really exciting new tool to help us with this conversation. JFO created essentially like a multi-year calendar that has fiscal year bands and school year bands and tax year bands and property tax year bands. And we're gonna get it printed big so that we actually know what we're talking about when we're talking.
I think that's a great idea.
Thank you.
I really do.
Another person was really excited.
I am excited about that because I keep trying to explain it to people. I go, oh.
It's nice to point stuff. Okay. Yes, I'm sorry, Representative Keeler, you had something.
I'm trying to imagine some of the calculations that you're doing, and I'm wondering how difficult it would be to run the numbers for just, if you assumed all budgets were level funded, then that would show the influence of all these other things that we're talking about. Is that a difficult thing to do, or does that just mean copying a column into another column and running?
So let me, before I answer, let me just make sure we're talking about the same thing. You're talking about taking FY24 budget data, so another FY24 education spending.
Yeah.
And dividing it by our new FY25 pupil count.
Yeah, just assume all the budgets
Or
are level
flat,
funded.
yeah. It's a piece of cake.
Piece of cake. So it seems to me that would provide some information on how much influence all these other factors have.
I think what would be useful in that exercise would be to compare that to the FY24 spending versus the restated FY24 people count.
Oh.
I think those would be the two numbers to get some idea of what the impact really is.
Is that also a piece of cake?
Yes, because he's already done that. I'm volunteering, Nicole.
That's okay.
You want to speak to what you saw when you did that? You can say no.
The answer is I can't at the moment because I have been living and breathing pupils. So I just don't in my mind, I'm not exactly sure what that said at this moment, but I am happy to either come back or if requested, send that analysis.
Representative Anthony.
Thanks. I wanted to talk to my school district board in the next couple of weeks. In the beginning of my paragraph would be calm down, and then I would go on from there. What I want to be able to say, and this is where you could help, I was there at the boarding of 127 and the switch in weights when Professor Colby came in, told us why the old weights were mysterious. The new weights, according to her, would really address needs. And my question to you, and it would hopefully help me in my paragraph, is have you tracked whether some of the folks under the old weight system who were systematically low per pupil spending districts or schools, have they mended their ways in the sense of responding to the increase in tax capacity, or haven't they? And I ask that from an area which now has a forced merger of very diverse communities. It's a more complicated, nuanced discussion for my district.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is no at the moment, because we don't have FY25 budget information. We now have FY25 pupil counts, but we do not have FY25 budget information. And in order to see that type of idea as to whether people are starting to change their behaviors, we need to see those data first. And then I think also 1 year does not a trend make, is the common saying. I think you're not going to really know until we've gone down the road a couple of years. We've had 2 or 3 years under our belts of what people are deciding to do with their spending. I come from a town similar to that where they're spending high. They were disadvantaged by the calculation, by the new calculation. And so it'll be interesting to see what they do. I think this first year, I don't think you're going to be able to really tease out any terribly relevant changes and information this first year, because I think of the 5% cap, I think that's going to put some pressure, or not pressure, pressure on the ed fund, and people deciding, well, we're over the 5% cap. We need to put in more access for handicapped kids or something like that. Let's just dump it in this year as a one-time expense where we're not really paying for it directly. I think you will see some of that this year. And then after that, I think we'll start to settle down. That's my personal perception of what's happening.
Thank you.
I appreciate that you used that as your example, like having well water that's drinkable is sort of another good example. These are all very reasonable expenses.
Yeah,
And they're sort of causing a bit of a perfect.
They are, and I can use Stowe as an example. And this is something I actually taught at Stowe at the high school years and years and years ago. And I didn't realize this when I was teaching there. They don't have a sprinkler system in the school. And when I heard that, I was absolutely shocked. So I would not be surprised if Stowe decided we're going to put a sprinkler system in this year. But I don't know.
Yeah, why not?
Sorry. House education, I know you have to leave us in 3 minutes. Is anyone there? Representative Conlon, would you like to add anything before you say goodbye? I'm sorry to.
No, I think we're good. We have the Brad and Nicole coming in the morning, and we'll save our questions until then, but we've appreciated the opportunity.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Representative Sims.
Yeah, just building a little bit on the previous discussion about how the changes in weights may be impacting spending or not. I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what AOE has been doing with districts leading up to this really big change. I know that there were like presentations in my community, which was historically underweighted, to kind of help raise awareness about the changes and what that might mean for budgets. Were there similar conversations and folks who were, I think I'm going to refuse to use the word disadvantaged, because we all win when kids everywhere have access to the resource they need, to sort of think about how to adjust to new tax capacity and will be providing equal and opposite support to those communities from an AOE leadership.
Since I've been here longer, I'll respond for Nicole too, and she can jump in. So it tends to be my.
It's fine.
I kind of like Jeff Francis. We just keep going. I think our role is not to be able to do that because we don't know. I mean, we don't run schools and we don't run school districts. It's the business managers and the superintendents who know that information. We will answer any question anybody asks us and explain things to them as much as we possibly can and go out and talk to people if they want us to. But I don't think we know enough to say, here's what you can do to reduce your budget or the other way. But here's what you do to reduce your budget if you want to keep the same tax rate and because your pupil count went down as opposed to up. I just frankly don't have the knowledge to do that on a good basis. Let's put it that way.
Well, I'm not suggesting necessarily that you, but it sounds like you're saying.
No, I'm talking about the agency. I'm really talking for the agency at the moment, I guess, by saying I. It's not what we do. We take budget information, but we don't do the budget. We don't tell them how to do it. Our special ed people will work with people, but that's the largest extent of it. Otherwise, you've got people in the titles and things like that. But I think it's really up to the business managers and superintendents, not necessarily in that order, to make those decisions and work with the school boards. At which point, again, any questions that we can help with interpretations of the law, but how this will work out, so that's where we are. That's what
I often feel like there's a really important role to play around technical assistance and like helping people adjust to change and get the support they need to be successful in ensuring people meet the needs of our kids and do that in an efficient and effective and equitable way. But here you go.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all.
Well, thank you. I anticipate seeing you again very soon. And I appreciate all the work you brought too.
I will say I like the idea of a regular scheduled Tuesday afternoon. I think it's a good idea. It helps.
Commissioner Bowyer, would you like to join us?
I take the fancy one?
Yeah.
I'll take the regular one. You don't want us to get too comfortable.
No, Jake would get the red chair after you.
I have him here if you guys ask me any really tough questions. Letter out. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
It is for this year, yeah. We're a whole week. Rebecca came over. Yeah, to you folks as well. Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner. Thanks for the opportunity to speak on this today. As the tax guy, you'll probably anticipate that much of my comments are more focused on property tax impacts. But I got to say, I really appreciate Jeff's philosophy. As the tax guy, I try to be friends with everyone as well. So we'll go on that. I might start, I recognize sort of the lane today is education spending, but I might just start speaking a little to sort of what I've heard over the last several weeks about the letter itself. And I want to be really clear, I'm not necessarily hearing that from members of this committee, and I think members of this committee are very well aware of those dynamics. But I've heard things like that the projections on the letter, that these are what we always see, and that it never comes true. And that, this is just an exercise from the administration to scare people, right? And so the first thing I want to say is these are consensus numbers, right? So the statute dictates how to do the math. And then the administration, folks like Jake and folks like Brad and Nicole from AOE and the Joint Fiscal Office, folks like Julia, all do the math together and make sure they all agree on the math, right? So it's not just the administration doing the math to try to scare people. And I would also say maybe other tax commissioners had a different philosophy, but it brings me no pleasure to have a very dire projection in the letter, right? The much easier letters are the one that say we have money falling from the sky and everything's fine, right? And so I do acknowledge, right, this is a starting point. The letter is a starting point. It does not have perfect information. And I would also acknowledge that the letter specifically for the last several years has been quite volatile in terms of the predictions that it had and where rates and yields ended up. But I think what I would want to highlight for this committee and anybody listening is that the spending projections have been pretty solid. The reason we've experienced so much volatility is unprecedented amounts of surplus revenue, often in the non-property tax revenue sources over performance of things like sales tax, right, that have allowed the ed fund to absorb different cost pressures, right? So I would I took this request for testimony to be sort of the start of a conversation that we're going to have over the course of the session. And so to start the conversation, I would just say, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but I do think that there's going to be a real challenge here to address, right? We're all going to be eager to see what actual budgets look like as we approach town meeting day. But I think there are real pressures here that are not just going to disappear from a pot of money falling into our laps like they have over some of the last several fiscal years, right? We are tracking on forecast for non-property tax revenues. And I don't want to speak for the economists, but that's been a different dynamic, right? Even last year, we knew the letter has to use the July e-board forecasts. We knew there were tens of millions of dollars coming that just couldn't be taken into consideration from, again, the statutory math. So again, focus more on the tax rate side of things. One of the things that we're talking about internally that I've heard some discussion about today that I think if the legislature is interested in looking at, we think would be a good idea is there a way to more equitably administer the 5% rate cap from Act 127? I heard the question earlier of, is there an incentive for districts to be over that cap? I think that there is. There's a couple of challenges that I think that districts are probably thinking about in this space. The first is that if in any of the next 5 years you are not over that cap, you lose that protection forever, right? I think I heard that comment, and that's true. And the other part is that all of the districts who are not over that cap are carrying the risk in the education fund of non-property tax revenue downturns and real estate market downturns, right? And I think that those two things combined do create an incentive to be over that cap, particularly for districts who naturally would be near that to maybe want to bump up spending a little bit to get over that cap to gain those protections, right? And I think that certainly as you move forward over the next 5 fiscal years, I think that incentive would remain. And so I do think that there's some pressure in the education fund coming from that. And I think if the legislature is willing, that's probably a worthwhile conversation to have, to say, is there a different way to do that? Is there another way to do that doesn't create those same pressures, that is more equitable and won't create some of those same cost pressures? The other two things that I would flag are not necessarily new things. These were items that we debated or spoke about during the original Act 127 debate. And those are that the excess spending threshold was suspended for 5 years as part of that bill, and also the ballot language that required the disclosure of the year-over-year per pupil spending on the ballot was suspended for 5 years. At the time, it made sense to the administration for fiscal year 25 to suspend those things, right? Because the way the pupil weighting was going to interact with district per pupil spending, that was going to be difficult to administer, and certainly some of the things wouldn't have made sense. But at the time, it did not make sense to us why you couldn't reinstitute both of those things starting in fiscal year 26 and moving forward. So again, I would say that both of those items still make sense to us. I would acknowledge that the ballot language is really more of a transparency issue than a cost containment measure, but both of those seem like useful ideas to be considering to reinstitute starting in fiscal year 26. And we're open to discussing any other ideas that the legislature might have that are aimed toward cost containment and sustainable education spending growth in the ed fund.
Aside from those levers that are sort of more specific to the 5% cap, I do have some other. Do you have any other ideas?
Those are the ideas I have with me today.
Are you gonna have other ideas? I really don't need to be sarcastic.
No, I mean, I think we're sort of looking for some.
Are there ideas that will come with the budget when like all the grand plans are released, or are they?
I think we're looking to get some feedback from the legislature about what kind of stuff you guys are interested in working together on. And we're happy to engage in that.
Certainly there's a lot of conversation about adding new revenue or, Julia highlighted all the tax expenditures that we have from exemptions to taxes. Are you interested in a conversation about some of those exemptions and repealing some of those exemptions?
Well, the governor is generally not a fan of new or increased taxes, but if there are some, sure, if there are proposals on the table, I'm happy to take a look at them.
Because I think we have increased taxes either way. I think the question is who is going to carry those taxes, and is it those who can sort of support it?
I take your point.
Okay, thank you. Representative.
Thank you. Commissioner, you may be able, I'm sure you could, from my previous question, that I worry that trying to remedy this situation, which admittedly is dire, unprecedented, perfect storms, whatever, the underlying attempt to encourage low spending schools, which are also low provision of needs schools under the new weights, might be further discouraged to catch up. And I worry that a remedy like discussing how the people game the 5% cap or whatever, initiating an anti-gaming strategy or anti-incentive that one agrees is perverse in some cases, instituting that without thinking about how that might discourage folks that, for instance, Act 27, my district, was intended to help because we've been historically low spending.
Yeah.
Is a worry for me. I mean, the pool of folks who are maybe over the cap may not be people who are gaming it. They may be people who are honestly responding to the whole point behind the revision in the weights.
Yeah, I appreciate that question because I didn't want my testimony to be that everyone who's over the cap is gaming it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying I think that there are, the way that it is structured, it does create some incentives for districts who might be on the edge, maybe to make decisions different than they would have otherwise. But totally true. I think that there are also going to be districts who are just over that cap because they are over that cap, right? Yeah. Because they lost capacity under Act 127, and that was what it was designed to help smooth out, right? So I think what you've highlighted, right, is that we've got to be really thoughtful about whatever that reform looks like. And so we're happy to engage in that discussion and have considerations for concerns like that. Absolutely. We're not blind to that challenge.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
You've covered all of it. Thank you so much.
Magic.
I would love to have a quick conversation about how the CLA works, if you don't mind, Jake. But we can also push it to another time.
It's a quick hour 45.
I didn't warn you, so I'm really happy to do it another time.
You need a tie.
What?
No tie on. It's okay.
I'm also not wearing a tie.
Yeah, and it needs to be a musical, like the school.
A number, if you will.
Oh, please make them do that. I will play it at the next school board meeting.
Hi, everybody. Jake Feldman, Tax Department.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for inviting us. I've had questions from a number of people about CLA this year, and some shock and awe at the numbers, and wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, and then how the CLA takes into it, how the tax rate in the December 1st letter takes into account sort of the property values that are contained within the CLA. That makes sense in the sentence.
Yeah, I think so. So the first part of the question, the shock, did you say shock and awe?
I might have, yeah.
CLAs are dropping this year. And so everybody knows a CLA is an adjustment factor applied to property tax rates in a town to ensure that the town is sending its fair share to the education fund, because you want to be taxing the town based on its fair market value rather than its value at the time of the last reappraisal. So that's what a CLA is. When the market is hot, like it is right now, CLAs drop. And that's what happened from last year to this year. I think it was about 10 points on average. So that's an overview of CLAs this year. Before I talk about the second part of the question, I know there's a lot of frustration, and I'm hearing it on CLAs, but the CLAs in a way are sort of rescuing the education fund this year. If somebody said, we're capping CLAs, we're not going to let them go down at all. What would happen is that you would be short about $200 million in the education fund. There would just be no revenue, and every single district in the state would be capped at the 5% because it would just push more burden onto them. So I'm in Montpelier Roxbury with Libby. We are capped at 5%, but our taxes are going up by about 20% next year, almost 20%, because our CLA is dropping.
They're projected to go up, you mean?
They will. No, they will. The reason is, no, I can explain.
But we don't know anything.
Budget is
Nothing has
not
been finalized. That's all I'm saying. That nothing.
Oh, that kind of world.
That's the world we live in.
Okay. All right. That's fair. So the second part of the question about the December 1st letter, and I think I actually just got a question on the sidelines about that. When we do the December 1st letter, we're busy working in November. The equalization study is happening at that time. And what I do is I pull out any CLAs that are finalized at that point to use. And if I don't have a final CLA from the equalization study, what I use is the town-wide ratio for all the sales in the town, which is a little bit different, but it's usually really close. So when we did the December letter, we thought statewide appreciation would be, I think, 14.3%, and then it actually came in at 14 or 13.8. So it's really, really close is what I'm trying to say. So there isn't a lot of variance between what we plugged in for the December 1st letter and what actually happened. And the small amount of variance, it doesn't make taxes go up or down overall. It's still 18.5. What it does is it changes the liability, the burden in between towns slightly, not a lot. And that's what CLAs are designed to do. They're designed to make sure the towns are sending their fair share to the education fund.
Thank you.
So rising tide, metaphors that you use. About the CLA.
Sure. I mean, I don't have any metaphors at this hour of the day, but I'm happy to use your metaphor.
Yes, the past couple of years have been an unusual situation. Usually CLAs kind of, some go up, some go down. But the past couple of years, it's basically everybody's going CLA going down. So that's kind of like a rising tide lifts all ships, but it's really like a rising tide makes all the ships stay at the same level, something like that. But anyway, it's a statewide phenomenon. Real estate is hot everywhere.
And so in this case, should people find that generally kind of reassuring that what might normally feel like a really big swing, you're experiencing that swing along with everybody else, and so we're not gonna see as dramatic changes as you might expect in.
Yes. Yeah, well said. So if, in a normal year, if your CLA went down by 10 percentage points, you'd say, darn. But that's the case for virtually every town. So it kind of washes through.
At least we can be reassured about one thing this year.
I think as we move forward this session, I'd love to have conversations about CLA versus statistical reappraisals and what that would sort of look like in the future. As sort of the energy around CLA gets like more and more hot, and, you know, just even thinking about how if this was a percentage added to someone's property value rather than a percentage added to their property tax rate, it's like people just might experience it differently, even though the actual number that they're paying at the end of the day is exactly the same. And so that's just, you know.
Yeah, we can definitely come back and talk about that. I will say that what Vermont does is called indirect equalization. We're adjusting the tax rate. There are some, not states, but or maybe Massachusetts, but some mostly counties and towns that do direct equalization, which is changing people's property values. That's not what we do. We're doing an adjustment factor to the tax rate, property tax rates.
Any other questions for Jake? Thank you.
No problem.
Do you have anything you want? Okay, just.
Sure.
Okay. Go for it.
I'll be brief. I recognize we've been sitting here for a
It's
while.
mostly just hot.
Yeah, no, it is. It's cooler in the hall. Yeah, so, for the record, what? Oh, no, you are the coolest committee, obviously. Yeah, to be clear. So for the record, Colin Robinson, Vermont NEA. I apologize for stepping out. Your committee colleagues across the hall were talking about healthcare. And so I just want to lift up the points that were made earlier around the major cost drivers impacting educator healthcare costs are the same ones impacting all Vermonters. So across the hall, they are hearing about Prescription Drug Affordability Board as a potential solution, as well as reference-based pricing. So these are broad systemic healthcare changes that would benefit all Vermonters, but of course also potentially impact costs for schools and school employees. And then also, I just want to ground it as you kind of close out today, back a bit where you started in the conversation about the increased student needs, student mental health, and just recognizing that our schools are backfilling a whole lot and doing a lot of things. School personnel and school boards and school administrators are stepping up to meet those needs to provide comprehensive educational supports to students. And that is something that it requires investment, and it isn't something that unfortunately is done cheaply for all the reasons that were previously mentioned because of the workforce dynamics. That's the reason you as legislators invested last year in the educator workforce, doing student loan forgiveness, all these dynamics with over 1,200 vacancies last year. You recognize we need to step into this space, and at local levels, they've been working to address those as well. So I don't feel need to sort of continue much beyond that, but I just wanted to note those couple points.
Thank you very much. And Jeff, I gave you the chance, if you wanted to hop back up, please, no pressure at all. And Sue, I realize that you have not said anything today, and if you'd like to jump in, you're welcome to share any thoughts, but again, no pressure, just offer. And thank you, Colin.
I think, thank you. I could just give very, very brief remarks on the Commission for Public School Employees Health Benefits. Sue Siglowski, Executive Director for the Vermont School Board Association. Last week in the House Education Committee, I provided some testimony just on the mechanics of how the current law works for statewide bargaining for public school employees' health benefits. And then Mark Koenig, who is the chair of the Employer Commissioners, testified on the past negotiations and the results of those negotiations and some ideas for possibly changing that system. And so if you would like to hear from him, I could certainly arrange for him to come in and speak with your committee. And he did file written testimony with House Ed, which you can find on their website.
Thank you. You're welcome. I think we'll probably leave that to House Ed unless as we do our work, but committee members are welcome to go watch that testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think with that, we are going to wrap up for the day. Thank you, everyone, very much. We are back here tomorrow at 9 a.m. And we're going to start right in American Vermont Bankers Association about property tax abatement and the flood